"You'll leave this marriage with nothing," my ex-husband said as the lawyer slid the documents across the polished walnut table. And for the first time in 38 years of marriage, I realized the man sitting across from me had been planning my disappearance long before he asked for the divorce. The conference room smelled faintly of expensive coffee and leather furniture polish. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago moved through another gray November afternoon, taxis splashing through rainwater while strangers hurried beneath umbrellas. Inside that room, time seemed to slow. Richard Carter sat with both hands folded calmly in front of him, wearing the same navy cashmere coat I had bought him for our anniversary 5 winters earlier. Beside him stood Nicole Hayes, my daughter-in-law, dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit that made her look less like family and more like someone preparing to take ownership of a company or a life. I stared down at the stack of papers in front of me. My name was still there, but barely. The vineyard in Napa Valley was gone. The lake house in Wisconsin was no longer listed among our shared properties. Even the investment account my father had left me 20 years ago had somehow been absorbed into a trust I'd never agreed to. My chest tightened, though I kept my expression perfectly still. At 67 years old, I had learned that humiliation becomes easier to survive when you refuse to let people watch it happen. "You should sign today," Richard said evenly. "Dragging this out will only make things harder on everyone." Everyone. What an interesting word. Nicole lowered her eyes as if she felt uncomfortable being there, but I noticed the corner of her mouth twitch slightly when the lawyer mentioned the transfer of the coastal property in Maine. That house had belonged to my mother. I remembered sanding the old cedar porch myself one summer while Jason chased fireflies across the yard with a mason jar in his hands. Back then, I still believed family memories made things permanent. "Mrs. Carter," the attorney asked carefully, "do you have any questions before we continue?" I looked down again, turning one page. Slowly after another, lines of legal language blurred together beneath the soft yellow lighting. Then I saw Jason's signature near the bottom of the final page. Witness: my son had signed the documents. My only child had watched this happen and said nothing. For a moment, the room became strangely quiet, as if all the air had been pulled out through the vents overhead. Richard avoided my eyes. Nicole suddenly became very interested in adjusting the bracelet on her wrist, and near the far end of the conference table sat a woman I barely knew well enough to call a friend. Lauren Mitchell, Nicole's closest friend for nearly 10 years. She had arrived late and hadn't spoken once since entering the room. But now, while everyone else watched me, Lauren stared at the table with the expression of someone silently attending a funeral. Her fingers trembled around her coffee cup. That was when I understood something important. Guilt always leaves traces. "Evelyn," Richard asked, impatience slipping into his voice, "are we going to do this peacefully or not?" I folded the papers carefully into a neat stack. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy, not because I forgave them, but because suddenly I understood that people become careless the moment they think they've already won. "Of course," I said softly. "I just need a little more time to review everything." Nicole relaxed immediately beside him. Richard leaned back in his chair. Across the room, Lauren finally looked up at me, and the fear in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Someone in that room still had a conscience, and before this was over, that conscience was going to destroy them. That night, I drove home through freezing rain with the divorce papers sitting untouched on the passenger seat beside me. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in slow rhythm while downtown Chicago disappeared behind me 1 block at a time. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, although I could still hear Richard's voice repeating inside my head. "You will leave this marriage with nothing." Funny how certain sentences stay warm long after the room that created them turns cold. By the time I reached the house in Lake Forest, the porch lights were already off. Richard used to leave them on whenever I drove at night. He once told me a home should always look like it is waiting for someone. Now the house looked as though it had already forgotten me. I stepped inside quietly and hung my coat near the front staircase. The silence felt different than it used to. Not peaceful, managed, controlled. The family portraits lining the hallway suddenly caught my attention in ways they never had before. In almost every recent photograph, Nicole stood closer to my son than I did. Sometimes she even stood closer to Richard. I stared at one framed picture from Jason's birthday dinner the previous spring. I remembered arriving early to help set the table, only to discover Nicole had already hired caterers without telling me. She had smiled sweetly and said, "You should relax more, Evelyn. Let younger people handle things now." At the time, everyone laughed softly. Even Jason. I laughed too because mothers learn very early that embarrassment becomes easier to swallow when disguised as humor. Upstairs, the bedroom smelled faintly of Richard's cologne and cedarwood candles. His side of the closet was nearly empty. I opened one drawer after another, noticing how carefully he had packed. Not rushed. Planned. Months ago, probably longer. A strange calm settled over me then. Betrayal rarely arrives suddenly. It arrives in tiny permissions. A canceled dinner. A changed password. A conversation that stops when you enter the room. I sat at the edge of the bed and opened the divorce folder again. This time I looked carefully. The trust amendments had been filed almost 8 months earlier. 8 months. That meant while I was planning our anniversary trip to Vermont, Richard had already been preparing my removal from his future. My chest tightened again, but I refused to cry. Tears would have made this feel temporary. What frightened me was how permanent it suddenly looked. Around midnight, I walked downstairs to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. That was when I noticed the light glowing beneath the door of Richard's old study. I froze. Slowly, I pushed the door open. Jason sat at the desk, still wearing his office clothes, staring down at his phone. For a second, he looked almost startled to see me. "Mom," he said quietly. "I did not hear you come in." I nodded once. Apparently, there are many things happening in this house I do not hear anymore. He lowered his eyes immediately, just like his father had done earlier that afternoon. The same guilt, the same avoidance. I looked around the study carefully. Richard's bourbon collection was gone. Several filing cabinets stood half empty. Even the family calendar hanging beside the bookshelf had been replaced with a clean new one that did not contain my handwriting anywhere on it. It was like watching someone erase fingerprints from a crime scene. Jason rubbed his hands together nervously. "Mom, things have just gotten complicated lately." I almost smiled at that. Complicated. Another interesting word. People always use soft language when describing ugly things they helped create. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed softly against the kitchen counter behind me. One new message. Unknown number. I stared at the screen while a cold feeling moved slowly through my stomach. "You need to look into the vineyard property before they sell it." It was signed with only one name. Lauren. I did not sleep that night. The house groaned softly around me the way old houses do during winter, settling against the cold while memories moved through the walls like quiet ghosts. Around 3 in the morning, I sat alone in the kitchen wearing one of my oldest wool sweaters, staring at Lauren's message glowing against the darkness of my phone screen. "You need to look into the vineyard property before they sell it." I read the sentence at least 20 times. Short messages often carry the heaviest truths. By sunrise, snow had started falling over Lake Forest in thin, restless flakes. The backyard looked pale and frozen beneath the gray morning sky. I brewed coffee and opened my laptop at the kitchen counter where I had once helped Jason with middle school science projects and college applications. Funny how ordinary places become unrecognizable once trust disappears from them. I logged into the family property accounts. First, or at least I tried to. My passwords no longer worked. Not one of them. The vineyard account. The main property records. Even the joint financial archive Richard and I had shared for decades suddenly rejected my access. Invalid credentials. The phrase appeared over and over again like a locked door slamming shut. I sat back slowly in my chair. Then I remembered something Richard used to joke about years ago when he was climbing the corporate ladder in his early 40s. "Control the paperwork," he would say with a laugh, "and you control the story." At the time, I thought he meant business. Now I understood he meant people too. Around 9 o'clock, Richard came downstairs already dressed for work, though I knew perfectly well he had not stepped inside his office in months. Men preparing to leave a marriage often continue performing routines long after the marriage itself is gone. He stopped briefly when he saw me at the counter. "You are up early," he said. "I could say the same thing about you," I replied calmly. His eyes shifted toward the laptop screen before quickly moving away. Small reactions reveal more than confessions ever do. He poured himself coffee without asking if I wanted more. Another small thing. Another tiny erasure. "Jason said you looked upset last night," he said carefully. "This process is difficult for everyone." There it was again. Everyone. The word people use when they want to distribute guilt evenly across a room that only contains one victim. I closed the laptop gently. Were you planning to tell me about the vineyard sale before or after it was finalized? For the first time in weeks, Richard hesitated. Barely a second, but enough. Nicole handles most of the investment restructuring now, he answered. She is very good with financial planning. Nicole. Not we. Not us. Nicole. I nodded once as though I accepted the explanation, but something colder had already begun forming quietly inside me. Not rage. Clarity. Richard left 20 minutes later. I watched from the kitchen window as his black Mercedes disappeared beyond the iron front gate while snow continued drifting across the driveway. The moment his car vanished, my phone vibrated again. Another message from Lauren. Check your personal email from 18 months ago. Search for digital authorization forms. Then, almost immediately after, a second message appeared. They think you never notice anything because you are polite. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I opened my email archive and typed exactly what she told me to search for. Hundreds of old documents appeared instantly. Insurance updates, banking notices, electronic approvals. Most looked ordinary at first glance, until one attachment stopped me cold. Authorization for trust modification, digitally signed under my name, dated 14 months earlier. On the exact weekend I had been in Boston visiting my sister after her knee surgery. I opened the signature page slowly. The signature looked almost perfect. Almost, but not quite. Richard had lived beside me for nearly 4 decades. He knew my handwriting better than anyone alive, which meant he also knew how to imitate it. There is a strange kind of grief that comes when you realize the people betraying you are no longer even trying to hide it well. That afternoon, I sat alone in the breakfast room while snow covered the backyard in soft white layers, and for the first time in months, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. I was not. The signs had been everywhere. I had simply spent years choosing peace over suspicion. The problem with women like me is that we are taught to smooth tension before we are taught to question it. I thought about the previous Christmas at our house. Nicole had insisted on redesigning the dining room table arrangement because she said it would feel more modern. Somehow my seat ended up pushed all the way to the far corner beside the china cabinet while she sat directly across from Richard at the center of the table. At one point during dinner, she reached over and adjusted his tie while laughing about something I could no longer remember. I remembered watching Jason notice it too. He had looked uncomfortable for exactly 2 seconds before taking another sip of wine and looking away. That was the moment families begin collapsing. Not when terrible things happen. When ordinary people decide not to react to them. I opened the digital authorization form again and zoomed in on the signature. Richard had copied the curve of my last name almost perfectly, but he pressed too hard on the letter C. I had not written my signature that way since my 40s. People who imitate you usually imitate an older version of you they still remember. I stared at the screen for a long time before finally printing every document connected to the trust modifications. The printer hummed steadily behind me while page after page slid into the tray like evidence entering a courtroom. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Jason appeared near the doorway, still wearing his dark wool coat from work. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Divorce does not only age marriages. It ages children too, even grown ones. Mom, he said carefully. Nicole mentioned you have been looking through financial records. Interesting. Not Richard. Nicole. I placed the papers neatly into a folder before answering. I was not aware I needed permission to review my own accounts. Jason sighed quietly and loosened his tie. Nobody is trying to hurt you. I almost laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because people always say those words after the damage is already done. He stepped farther into the room, avoiding eye contact again. Dad thinks it would be easier if everyone stayed calm and handled this privately. Calm. Another beautiful word people use while stealing from you. I looked at my son carefully. His shoulders were tense. His wedding ring caught the afternoon light as he rubbed his hands together nervously. I suddenly remembered him at 10 years old standing beside me in the kitchen after accidentally breaking one of my favorite serving bowls. He had cried harder over disappointing me than over the bowl itself. Back then, guilt still made him honest. Did you know they changed the trust 14 months ago? I asked softly. His silence answered first. Then came the look. That small collapse people cannot hide once the truth reaches the room before they do. Jason sat down slowly across from me. Mom, Dad said it was temporary. Temporary. I nodded once and folded my hands together. Outside, Snow continued drifting quietly across the frozen yard. And the forged signature? His face went pale immediately. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just enough for me to know Lauren had been telling the truth. Jason stared at the table for several seconds before whispering. Nicole handled the paperwork. There it was. The first crack. Small, but real. I leaned back in my chair and studied my son carefully while the printer continued spitting out page after page behind me like a machine refusing to stop telling the truth. The next morning, I began pretending to become exactly the kind of woman they expected me to be. Confused, emotional, too overwhelmed to pay attention. It was remarkable how quickly people relaxed once they believed you were no longer a threat. At breakfast, I deliberately misplaced my reading glasses 3 separate times while Nicole stood near the kitchen island scrolling through her phone. I swear my memory has been terrible lately, I said softly while searching the counter even though the glasses were sitting directly beside my coffee cup. Nicole exchanged a quick glance with Richard before smiling in that careful, polished way she always used whenever she wanted to appear compassionate. Stress can do that, she replied. Maybe it would help if you took a break from all the financial paperwork. There was something almost elegant about the manipulation. Never direct, never loud. Just gentle suggestions designed to slowly remove authority from your hands while making you feel guilty for noticing it. Richard folded his newspaper neatly and stood to leave for another one of his imaginary workdays downtown. Nicole is right, he added casually. You should let professionals handle complicated matters now. Professionals. I nodded quietly and stirred cream into my coffee while the winter sunlight spilled across the marble countertops. Then I watched both of them leave the kitchen believing they had successfully reduced me into a frightened old woman struggling to keep up with reality. The moment the front door closed, I stopped shaking entirely. By 10:30, I was sitting inside a private office 3 miles away from our home across from Martin Feldman, the attorney who had represented me during a corporate acquisition nearly 20 years earlier. He looked older now, thinner around the face, but his eyes remained sharp behind his silver glasses. You always did know when something smelled wrong, he said after reviewing the forged documents carefully. This is not amateur work. I sat calmly with my gloves folded in my lap while snow drifted outside his office windows. Richard spent 40 years negotiating contracts, I replied. He knows exactly how far he can push people before they notice. Martin removed his glasses slowly. The question is whether he realizes you noticed already. I almost smiled at that, because the truth was, Richard had spent decades underestimating one important thing about me. Before I became a wife, before motherhood, before charity galas and dinner parties and social expectations softened the edges of my life, I had spent 12 years working in corporate negotiations for one of the largest hospitality firms in the Midwest. I knew how powerful people behaved when they thought control belonged entirely to them. They became impatient, predictable, careless. Martin leaned back in his chair while flipping through the trust modifications again. You need a forensic accountant immediately, he said. And you need access to every property transfer connected to Nicole Hayes. Hearing her full name spoken aloud inside a legal office changed something inside me. Until then, Nicole had existed in my life as family. Suddenly, she sounded exactly what she truly was. A liability. By early afternoon, Martin connected me with a forensic accounting specialist named Diane Mercer, a quiet woman with sharp blue eyes and the unsettling ability to notice details before most people finish speaking. She studied the documents silently for nearly 20 minutes before finally saying, someone moved money through at least 3 separate holding accounts. Whoever organized this planned it very carefully. Planned. Again, that word settled heavily inside my chest. Not impulsive betrayal. Structured betrayal. Layered. Patient. I left the office just before sunset. Carrying copies of every document in a plain brown leather portfolio Martin insisted I keep hidden outside the house. The temperature had dropped into the 20s, and icy wind swept across the parking garage as I walked toward my car. My phone buzzed before I reached the driver's door. Another message from Lauren. Be careful. Nicole thinks you suspect nothing. I stared at the screen for several seconds before typing my first response to her. Then let her keep believing that. A minute later, 3 small dots appeared on the screen as Lauren began typing back. Then disappeared. Then returned again. Finally, only one sentence arrived. You have no idea what she has been saying about you behind your back. Lauren asked me to meet her 2 days later at a small cafe near the North Side Marina, far enough from Lake Forest that nobody from our social circle would accidentally recognize us. The lake wind was brutal that morning, cutting across the sidewalks hard enough to make people lower their heads beneath scarves and wool hats. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a quiet table near the back window where I could see the entrance. Old instincts return quickly when trust disappears from your life. Lauren walked in wearing a camel-colored coat with oversized sunglasses despite the gray weather outside. She looked nervous before she even sat down. Her hands trembled slightly while removing her gloves. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. I studied her for several seconds before answering. "You seem frightened of your best friend." Lauren let out a small laugh that did not sound amused. "Nicole is not really capable of friendship." The waitress brought coffee neither of us touched. Around us, people worked on laptops or spoke quietly over pastries while soft jazz drifted through the cafe speakers. Ordinary life continued peacefully around the edges of betrayal. That was always the strangest part to me. Lauren stared down at the table before finally speaking again. "You know what the worst thing about people like Nicole is?" she asked softly. "They never start cruel. They start charming." I said nothing. Silence makes people reveal more than questions do. Lauren folded her hands together tightly. "When we first met, she used to talk constantly about wanting stability. A beautiful family, a successful husband, a respected life." She paused briefly, but eventually I realized she did not want to build those things. She wanted to take them from other people. A cold heaviness settled quietly in my chest. Not surprise anymore. Recognition. Lauren reached into her purse and slid a small envelope across the table toward me. Inside were printed screenshots of text messages, bank transfer confirmations, photos of documents. I turned each page slowly while the sounds of the cafe faded into the background around me. One text message from Nicole stopped me completely. "Older women are the easiest to erase because everybody already expects them to disappear quietly." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The words themselves were ugly enough, but what unsettled me most was how casually they had been written, like discussing weather or grocery lists. Lauren watched my face carefully. "She said things like that all the time," she whispered, "especially after your husband started relying on her for financial advice." Husband, not Richard. Even now, Lauren instinctively used respectful language around my marriage while exposing the woman helping destroy it. "How long?" I asked calmly. Lauren lowered her eyes. "Almost 2 years. 2 years. Long enough to infiltrate routines. Long enough to reshape loyalties. Long enough to convince my son that protecting his mother was somehow less important than keeping peace with his wife." I continued reading the documents silently. Offshore account references, property transfers, notes about restructuring assets before the divorce filing became public. Then I found something else. A photograph taken at a private dinner downtown. Richard sat beside Nicole, smiling in a way I had not seen directed toward me in years. Her hand rested lightly on his arm beneath the restaurant lighting. Intimate enough to cross boundaries. Subtle enough to deny if confronted. Lauren's voice became quieter. "I think she enjoyed replacing you more than she enjoyed the money." That sentence lingered between us for several seconds. Outside the cafe window, snow flurries drifted across the marina parking lot while boats rocked gently against frozen docks. I suddenly remembered something my mother used to tell me when I was young. Envy is never satisfied by ownership. It only relaxes when the original owner is forced to watch. Lauren finally looked directly at me for the first time all morning. "There is something else," she said carefully. "Nicole is planning a dinner party next week." I closed the envelope slowly. "To celebrate what?" Lauren hesitated. Then she answered in almost a whisper. "Your replacement." The invitation arrived 3 days later in a cream-colored envelope embossed with gold lettering so expensive it almost felt theatrical. Nicole had always understood presentation. That was part of what made her dangerous. People forgive cruelty more easily when it arrives dressed beautifully. I opened the envelope slowly while standing alone in the front hallway beneath the chandelier Richard and I had chosen together during a trip to New York almost 30 years earlier. Celebration dinner. New beginnings. Saturday at 7 o'clock. Cocktail attire requested. No mention of divorce. No mention of family restructuring. just enough elegance to disguise humiliation as sophistication. I almost admired the strategy. Almost. By the morning of the dinner party, the house had transformed into something that no longer resembled mine at all. Florists moved through the rooms carrying white orchids and pale roses, while catering staff polished wine glasses in the kitchen. Nicole supervised everything personally, walking through the dining room with a clipboard in one hand and an expression of calm authority on her face. Watching another woman organize your home like a future owner creates a very specific kind of silence inside you. Not heartbreak anymore. Something colder. More disciplined. Do you think the candles should stay on the piano? Nicole asked one of the decorators as though she had lived there for years. I stood near the staircase, listening quietly while adjusting the sleeve of my navy silk blouse. Nobody noticed me at first. Then Nicole turned and smiled with practiced warmth. "Evelyn," she said sweetly, "you look wonderful tonight." I returned the smile carefully. "So do you." And she did. Nicole wore an ivory satin dress that moved elegantly when she walked through the room. Not white exactly, but close enough to send a message. Replacement does not always announce itself directly. Sometimes it simply redecorates around you until people forget where you originally stood. Around 6:30, guests began arriving through the front entrance. Business associates, country club friends, couples I had hosted for decades inside this very house. Several women kissed my cheek politely before drifting toward Nicole as if social gravity itself had already shifted permanently in her direction. I watched it happen calmly from beside the fireplace with a glass of sparkling water in my hand. Every room contains a hierarchy. Once you notice movement inside it, you can never unsee it again. Richard moved easily through the crowd wearing a charcoal suit and the relaxed confidence of a man convinced the difficult part of his life was already over. Every now and then his eyes found mine across the room, searching carefully for signs of anger or emotional collapse. I gave him neither. The most unsettling thing you can offer dishonest people is composure. At exactly 7:15, Jason arrived alone. His face tightened slightly the moment he stepped inside and saw the dining room arrangement. Nicole had seated herself directly beside Richard at the center of the table. My place sat farther down near the end beside two distant acquaintances from their investment circle. Even now, she could not resist making the symbolism visible. Jason approached me quietly while removing his coat. "Mom," he said under his breath, "you do not have to stay for this." I looked at my son carefully. The exhaustion beneath his eyes had deepened over the past week. Guilt ages people faster than stress ever could. "No," I replied softly. "Tonight is important." His expression shifted slightly then, almost as though he sensed something changing beneath the surface of the evening. Before he could ask anything else, Lauren entered through the front door. The entire atmosphere around Nicole changed for half a second. Tiny, nearly invisible, but enough for me to notice. Lauren wore a simple black dress with no jewelry except small diamond earrings. Unlike everyone else in the room, she did not move toward the bar or greet the crowd immediately. She walked directly to me instead. "You came," she whispered quietly. "Of course," I answered while watching Nicole laugh too loudly across the room beside Richard. People should never miss the final act of their own funeral. Dinner began exactly the way Nicole intended it to. Expensive wine flowed easily across the table, while candlelight reflected softly against crystal glasses and polished silverware. Outside, snow continued falling over Lake Forest in thick white sheets, sealing the house into its own private world. Inside, people laughed too loudly at stories that were not especially funny. Wealthy people often mistake volume for happiness. I sat quietly near the end of the table, listening while Nicole guided conversations with the confidence of someone already rehearsing ownership. Every detail of the evening had been designed carefully. The white orchids, the custom menus, even the music drifting softly from hidden speakers throughout the dining room. She wanted elegance, control, public confirmation that my absence from the future had already been accepted socially before the divorce was even finalized. Halfway through dinner, Richard stood and lifted his wine glass gently against the room. Conversation faded immediately. "I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight," he said smoothly. "This year has brought many changes, but sometimes change creates room for new beginnings." New beginnings. Around the table, several guests nodded politely. Nicole lowered her eyes with practiced humility while resting one hand lightly against Richard's wrist beneath the candlelight. The gesture lasted only a second. Long enough. Jason stared down at his untouched wine glass beside me. Lauren remained perfectly still across the room, near the fireplace. Richard continued speaking. Life does not always unfold the way we expect, but eventually we learn that honesty is kinder than pretending. Interesting choice of words from a man built entirely from deception. Then Nicole stood beside him, smiling softly. Family evolves, she added, and growth sometimes requires difficult transitions. Transitions. The language of people who hurt others while wanting to sound emotionally intelligent doing it. Several guests offered quiet applause. Someone near the far end of the table even raised a glass toward Nicole. That was the moment I realized none of them actually understood what kind of evening they had attended. They thought they were witnessing a social repositioning, a sophisticated divorce, a graceful replacement. They had no idea they were sitting inside the collapse of a fraud. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table and stood. The room grew quiet immediately. Richard's expression shifted almost invisibly. Concern first, then caution. Nicole smiled politely, but I noticed her shoulders tighten beneath the ivory satin fabric. Before tonight ends, I said calmly, I believe there are a few details everyone deserves to understand clearly. Nobody interrupted me. Wealthy rooms rarely stop women from speaking. They simply expect those women to embarrass themselves emotionally once they begin. I reached into the leather portfolio resting beside my chair and removed several folders. Then I placed them gently onto the center of the dining table beside the candles and wine glasses. Over the past 14 months, I continued quietly. Multiple family assets were transferred through unauthorized trust modifications using forged digital signatures filed under my name. The silence that followed felt immediate and physical. Richard's face lost color first. Nicole remained motionless beside him, though her smile disappeared entirely. Across the room, Lauren lowered her eyes. I slid copies of the documents towards several guests nearest the center of the table. Bank transfers, property records, offshore account summaries. The dining room suddenly filled with the soft sound of paper unfolding beneath crystal chandeliers. Evelyn, Richard interrupted sharply. This is neither the time nor the place. I looked directly at him for the first time. All evening. Actually, I replied softly. You chose the time and place yourself. Nicole stepped forward then, her voice calm but tighter now. These accusations are ridiculous. Are they? I asked. Then I removed my phone from my handbag and placed it on the table. One touch opened the audio file Lauren had provided earlier that afternoon. Nicole's own voice filled the dining room speakers clearly enough for every guest to hear. Older women are the easiest to erase because everybody already expects them to disappear quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the catering staff standing near the kitchen entrance froze completely. Jason stared at Nicole like he was seeing her for the first time in his life. Richard looked at Lauren in disbelief. And Nicole finally understood something terrifying. The room no longer belonged to her. The divorce was finalized 6 months later on a quiet Tuesday morning in March, while rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows in downtown Chicago. By then, most of the damage had already unfolded publicly. Nicole's carefully constructed image had collapsed faster than even I expected. Once the financial investigation began, people who once admired her suddenly remembered strange conversations, unusual transfers, uncomfortable moments they had ignored because elegance often disguises dishonesty until someone forces the lights brighter. Richard lost 2 corporate board positions within weeks after the trust documents became part of the legal proceedings. Investors dislike scandal almost as much as they dislike incompetence. Jason separated himself from Nicole shortly after the dinner party. Not dramatically. No screaming. No headlines. Just quiet distance growing wider each day until silence finally became permanent. Funny how relationships built through betrayal rarely survive once trust becomes necessary. I moved to Maine before spring fully arrived. The coastal house overlooking the Atlantic had been restored legally to my name after Martin and Diane uncovered the unauthorized transfers tied to the forged signatures. The first morning I woke there alone. Fog rolled gently across the shoreline while gulls circled above. The water outside my bedroom window. For the first time in years, the silence around me felt honest. I spent my days slowly rebuilding routines that belonged entirely to me. I bought fresh flowers every Friday from a small family-owned market near the harbor. I walked along the rocky shoreline each morning wearing heavy sweaters against the ocean wind. Sometimes I sat beside the fireplace at night listening to old jazz records while snow drifted quietly against the windows. Peace does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it returns so softly you almost fail to recognize it at first. Jason visited for the first time in early April carrying a bakery box from a little place downtown he used to love as a boy. He looked older than 39 now. Regret has a way of thinning people around the eyes. We sat together on the back porch wrapped in blankets while waves crashed below the cliffs beneath us. For a long time neither of us spoke. Then finally he said the words I think he had been carrying inside himself for months. I should have protected you. I looked out toward the gray Atlantic horizon before answering. You should have protected yourself too. He lowered his head after that. Some truths do not need punishment attached to them. Their existence is painful enough already. Lauren visited later that same month. By then, she had completely disappeared from Nicole's life and looked noticeably lighter because of it. There are certain people whose absence improves the atmosphere around you immediately, like opening windows inside a room that has been closed too long. Over dinner one evening, Lauren asked quietly, "Do you ever wish you had exposed them sooner?" I considered the question carefully while swirling wine inside my glass. Outside, waves struck the rocks below the house with slow rhythmic force. "No," I said finally. "People eventually reveal themselves completely. You just have to stop interrupting them." A week later, a letter from Richard arrived by mail. Handwritten. For pages long. Apologies. Explanations. Regret wrapped carefully inside polished language the same way he had negotiated every difficult conversation throughout our marriage. I carried the envelope unopened to the fireplace and stood there for a long moment watching the flames move behind the glass doors. Then I dropped the letter directly into the fire. Not because I hated him anymore. That was the strange part. Hatred had disappeared somewhere between the courtroom and the ocean. What remained instead was clarity. Richard had spent years believing my kindness came from weakness. Nicole had mistaken patience for blindness. Both of them failed to understand the same thing. Quiet women notice everything. We simply decide carefully when speaking becomes necessary. That night, I stood alone on the back porch wrapped in a wool coat, while cold Atlantic wind moved through my silver hair. Far below, the tide pulled steadily against the shoreline beneath the moonlight. And for the first time in a very long time, I no longer felt abandoned. I felt free.